This meeting is reports of the Secretary General on the Sudan and South Sudan. The agenda is adopted. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of the item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2024/223, the text of the draft resolution submitted by the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
предлагаемый сегодня на рассмотрение проект резолюции Совета Безопасности, подготовленный Великобританией, преследует, как может показаться, благородную цель – дать возможность Совету высказаться за прекращение огня в Судане, наращивание гуманитарного доступа, поддержку ООНовских посреднических усилий. Однако большинство из этих задач уже реализуется, в том числе благодаря конструктивному настрою суданских властей. Удивляет, что в случае с Суданом наши западные коллеги, ссылаясь на необходимость неотложного решения гуманитарной ситуации, предложили в авральном порядке принять в ФСБ резолюцию с четким призывом к прекращению боевых действий. При этом очные консультации по проекту не проводились, конструктивные предложения были проигнорированы, а сам процесс форсировался. У нас нет иллюзий насчет истинных намерений западных стран. Однако их двойные стандарты выглядят особенно вопиюще, с учетом того, что эти же страны затягивают принятие документа о прекращении огня в секторе Газа, где продолжается настоящая бойня, где за 5 месяцев погибли более 30 тысяч человек.
5 months, more than 30,000 people have died. The USA time and again uses its veto, plays for time, and demands that we wait for some results from its direct diplomacy on the ground. Nothing of the sort is proposed for Sudan, although now is precisely when there is an opportunity to establish mediation efforts. Do you really think that this hypocrisy is not visible to everyone? Russia, from the very beginning, proposed settling on the most suitable product for the situation in Sudan, press statement or a presidential statement. However, unfortunately, our appeals were not heeded, and we also didn't receive any cogent explanation. And the time factor here isn't relevant either. References to the need to urgently rectify the situation due to Sudan closing routes for the delivery of assistance across the border with Chad are no longer relevant. The Sudanese authorities have shown a constructive stance, and on the 5th of March they took a decision to authorize the delivery of humanitarian cargo through points on the border with Chad, South Sudan, Egypt, and also by air to a number of airports. We call upon our colleagues to refrain from using the Security Council to advance their own geopolitical ambitions and to approach discussing the situation in the Republic of Sudan based on the interests of the people of that country. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in documents S/2024/223 please raise their hand. Those against. Abstentions. The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favor, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 2724 to 2024. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. With the adoption of this resolution, the Council has sent a strong and clear message to the Sudanese Armed Forces and Rapid Support Forces to agree an immediate cessation of hostilities during the month of Ramadan. This follows the call of the Secretary-General and the African Union. We urge the Sudanese Armed Forces and Rapid Support Forces to act on this united international call for peace and to silence the guns. We further urge the warring parties to build trust and seek a sustainable resolution to the conflict through dialogue. President, the situation in Sudan is of grave concern, and the humanitarian needs of Sudan's population are acute. We support the work of UN agencies and civil society organisations in their efforts to support those in need and underline the need for full, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. We welcome all mediation efforts to help achieve an end to this brutal conflict and further encourage the Secretary-General's personal envoy, Ramtane Lamamra, to complement and help coordinate regional efforts. President, this Council needs to continue to support efforts for peace in Sudan. We look forward to working across the UN, the region, and Council members towards this goal. And in that regard, I thank my colleagues across the Council for their engagement on this resolution. Let me express my thanks also to our team and all of the colleagues and experts who agreed this text. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
Mr.
Россия
President,
воздержалась при
Russia
голосовании по
abstained during the
подготовленному
vote
Великобританией
on the
проекту резолюции
UK-prepared
о
draft
прекращении боевых
resolution
действий
on
в
the
Судане.
cessation of hostilities in
Мы приняли
Sudan.
решение
We
пропустить данный
decided
проект резолюции, поскольку речь идет о жизни
let this resolution
суданцев,
through because
которые
it
по
is a
всей
question of the
стране
lives of the
страдают
Sudanese
от
people who
последствий
are suffering
конфликта.
across the country from the
Прекращение
consequences of the
насилия в
conflict.
Судане, безусловно,
Ending the
должно быть
violence in Sudan should,
первоочередной
of course,
целью
be
не
the
только
primary
Совета
aim, not just of the
Безопасности,
Security
но главное
Council,
самих
but most
суданцев.
importantly of the Sudanese
Мы
people
последовательно
themselves.
призываем
We
суданские стороны к
consistently
такому
have been
шагу.
calling upon the
Считаем,
Sudanese
что это
parties to
путь
take
к
this step.
решению
We believe
всех
that this is the
стоящих
way
перед
to
ними
resolve
проблем
all of the
и
problems they
достижению
face and to
политико-дипломатического
achieve a political
урегулирования.
and diplomatic settlement.
Уверены в том,
We are
что
confident
суданцы несут
that the
главную
Sudanese
ответственность за
bear primary
положение в стране.
responsibility for the
Они
situation in
сами
the country.
должны и
They
могут определять
themselves
свое
must and
будущее.
can determine their future.
Задача ответственных
The
представителей
job of
международного
responsible
сообщества,
representatives of the
включая
international
членов Совета
community, including members
Безопасности,
of the Security
заключается в
Council,
том, чтобы этому
is to
содействовать,
facilitate that
а не навязывать
and not
собственные
to
правила
impose
и
their own
принципы
rules and
суверенному
principles
государству.
on sovereign states.
За этим должны стоять реальные
Behind
шаги,
this, there should be
кропотливая
real
работа
steps,
и конструктивный
meticulous work,
подход,
and a constructive
поощряющий
approach,
суданцев на поиск
encouraging the
компромисса.
Sudanese to pursue compromises.
Отдельно остановимся на теме оказания
Separately,
гуманитарного
we
содействия
will address
и
the issue of
доступа.
humanitarian assistance
Твердо
and
стоим на
access.
позиции о
We are
том, что
firmly
такая помощь
of the position
может
that this
оказываться только в
assistance can only be
соответствии с
provided in
руководящими
accordance with
принципами
the
на
guiding
этот счет,
principles on this subject,
закрепленными в резолюции
enshrined in
Генеральной
General Assembly
Ассамблеи
Resolution
46-182,
46/182,
согласно которым
according to which
все содействие
all
нуждающимся
assistance
странам
to
предоставляется
countries
с
in need
согласия
is
и в
provided
тесной
with the
координации
consent
с
and in close
национальными
coordination
правительствами.
with the national governments.
Исходим из того, что
We are of the
Управление
view
ООН по
that
координации
the UN Office for the
гуманитарных
Coordination
вопросов
of
и
Humanitarian
другие
Affairs and
гуманитарщики
other
будут
humanitarian
действовать
workers
с полным
will
уважением
act
суверенитета
in full
Судана.
respect of the sovereignty of Sudan.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
в заключение
in
хотели бы
conclusion, we would
подчеркнуть
like to
нашу
underscore
поддержку
our support
независимости,
for the
суверенитета и
independence,
территориальной
sovereignty and
целостности
territorial
Судана
integrity of
и
Sudan
выразить надежду
and
на
express the
скорейшее
hope
нахождение
for
суданцами без
the
внешнего
Sudanese people,
диктата
without any
решений по
outside dictate,
урегулированию
quickly
конфликта,
finding solutions
политического и
to
социального
resolving the
устройства их
conflict and for
страны.
the political
Я
and
благодарю
social
за
makeup of their
внимание.
country. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I apologize for the this. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States is pleased the Council united to pass this resolution today, and I want to offer my congratulations to the United Kingdom for the hard work that this delegation undertook to try to get a consensus on this text. Nearly 1 year into the conflict, it is important this Council has spoken with one voice to condemn the violence, demand a ceasefire, and call on the parties to ensure removal of obstructions to the provision of critical humanitarian assistance. We acknowledge this week's announcement that the Sudanese government has agreed to one cross-border access route by land from northern Chad and access by air, but this is insufficient. Addressing the dire humanitarian needs of all Sudanese requires unhindered cross-line and cross-border access from multiple points of entry to the most devastated areas of Sudan. More action is urgently needed to ensure life-saving aid reaches Sudan's most vulnerable. Failure by SAF authorities to rescind prohibitions on cross-border aid will cause unnecessary death and suffering among the Sudanese people. Both the SAF and RSF must facilitate unhindered humanitarian access to avert catastrophe and must adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law. Preventing a famine and long-term catastrophe will require both a ceasefire and unhindered humanitarian access. We condemn in the strongest terms atrocities committed by both parties in Sudan. We demand the parties do more to protect, not target, civilians in all circumstances, respect human rights, and comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. As we have said before, this tragedy has gone on too long. We must unite to prevent and stop the flow of weapons that is fueling this conflict. We are grateful for the Council's work on the Sudan Panel of Experts resolution and ask for your continued support to adopt the resolution today to renew the mandate of the Panel of Experts. Finally, we reiterate our support for the Secretary General's personal envoy to Sudan, Ramtan Lamamra. We will continue to do everything in our power to support his work. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I apologize my confusion. And I give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President,
中方对刚刚表决
China
的
voted
呼
in
吁
favor
苏
of the
丹冲
draft
突双方
resolution,
在
which
3月
calls for
停火的
cessation
决
of
议草案
hostilities
投
during
了
the
赞
month
成
of
票。
Ramadan by parties to the
苏
conflict
丹
in the
冲突
Sudan.
爆发已
It
近
has
1
been
年，
almost a year since
平
the
民
outbreak
伤亡
of the
惨重，
conflict in the Sudan. It
人
has
道
caused
危机
heavy
严
civilian
峻，
casualties,
外
severe
溢影响
humanitarian
不断扩
crisis,
大，
and widening
令人痛
spillover
心。
effects, which is saddening.
在约即将到来，
Ramadan is
这对
approaching,
广大穆斯林来
which is
说
a very
是一
holy
段十
time
分
for the
神圣的日
Muslims.
子。我们呼吁冲
We
突
call
双
on
方
parties to the
以国家
conflict
和人民
to
利益
put the
为重，
interests of the country and
切
its
实
people
停
first,
火止战，
effectively
把
observe a
安理会
cessation of
决议
hostilities,
落到实处。
and implement the Security Council
国际
resolutions
社会要
through
继续
concrete
加大
actions.
外
The
交
international
斡
community
旋
should
努力，
continue to step up
为
diplomatic
冲突
and
双方
mediation
和
efforts
平谈
to
判
create
创造
favorable
有利条
conditions for
件，
peace negotiations
让
between
苏
the
丹早日
parties,
恢复
with a
全
view
面
to
和平。
restoring comprehensive peace
同
in the
时，
Sudan at an early
有
date.
关行动
At the
要
same
切
time,
实
the
尊
relevant
重
actions
苏丹
should
的主
effectively
权和
respect
领
the
土完整，
sovereignty and
不
territorial
干涉苏
integrity
丹
of the
内政。
country, and refrain from
中方欢迎
interfering
苏
in
丹
its
政
internal
府
affairs.
近日
China
向联合
welcomes
国人
the
道机
recent
构开
efforts
放
made by
部
the
分过
government
境
of the
点，
Sudan to open
为
some
保
border
障人道
crossings
主义
to
准
UN
入
humanitarian
所作努力。
agencies to guarantee
我们
humanitarian
呼吁国际
access.
社会
We
在
call on the
遵
international
守
community
联合
to,
国人
on
道
the
救
basis of
援原
compliance
则的
with
基础
UN
上，
humanitarian
继
principles,
续帮助
continue
苏
to
丹
help the
及
Sudan
邻
and
国
its neighboring
提高
countries
人道
improve
响
their
应能力，
humanitarian response
防止
capacity
人道危
to
机恶
prevent the
化。
humanitarian crisis from getting worse.
值得注意的是，
It is worth noting
在
that
此次呼吁苏丹
on
停火问
calling
题
for
上，
a cessation of
安理会本
hostilities
可以
in the Sudan,
以更
the
加团
Council
结一致
could
的
have
形式发
spoken
声，
with greater unity,
但执笔国没
but the
有就
pen
此
holder
做
didn't
进一
make
步的
further
努力，
efforts to that
我们
end,
对此感到遗
which we
憾。
find regrettable.
主席先生，
Mr. President,
世界上所有
the
的人的
lives
生
of
命
all people in the
都
world
是
are
宝
precious.
贵的。安理会就苏
While
丹冲
adopting a
突在月
resolution
停
on
火
the ceasefire
通过
during the
决议
month
的
of
同时，
Ramadan in the Sudan,
不能忘
the
记加
Security
沙
Council
的
must
人
not
民
forget that
仍在
the people
炮
of
火中
Gaza
遭
are
受
still
苦
suffering
难。
under bombardment.
The
international community must push for an immediate ceasefire and an end to the conflict in Gaza to give the people some hope for survival and provide the basic security necessary for religious activities by the Muslims there. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. This explanation of vote is delivered on behalf of the A3+, namely Guyana, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Algeria. The A3+ expresses its appreciation to the United Kingdom for the steady efforts made despite the time constraint present during the negotiation process. We believe this resolution will significantly contribute without any doubt to the well-being of the population in Sudan. Today marks an important milestone which will pave the way toward a peaceful and stable Sudan through the adoption by the Security Council on this very resolution calling for a ceasefire during the holy month of Ramadan. This decisive action reflects a collective commitment to promoting peace and stability in the country during this sacred and spiritually significant period. Hence, it is our hope that the Sudanese actors will seize this opportunity to lay down their weapons and create an atmosphere for dialogue, further humanitarian access, and a cease of hostilities in order to advance collectively on a track conducing to a peaceful future. The A3+ hails the commendable decision taken by the Sudanese authorities to ease humanitarian access through different border crossings. By opening them, the Sudanese government is providing a lifeline aiming to reach affected areas where the assistance is urgently required. Mr. President, at this stage, prioritizing the coordination of regional and international efforts as well as harmonizing the different initiatives becomes crucial. The goal is to bring closer the various internal actors for an inclusive dialogue in order to find Sudanese solutions to Sudanese problem without any foreign interference, and ultimately forge a path toward a viable peace. We would like to reiterate our unwavering support to the Secretary General of the United Nations, to his personal envoy, to the African Union and the IGAD for their mediation efforts and good offices, as well as their pursuit to foster dialogue, reconciliation, and sustainable solutions for the well-being of the people of Sudan. In conclusion, Mr. President, Guyana, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and Algeria reaffirmed their commitment to work constructively and tirelessly with the Security Council members for a peaceful and prosperous future in Sudan. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. The 9,569 meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is reports of the Secretary General of the Secretary General on the Sudan and South Sudan. The agenda is adopted. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2024/212, the text of a draft resolution submitted by the United States of America. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/212 please raise their hand? Those against? Those abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 13 votes in favor, 2 abstentions. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 2725/2024. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States is pleased the Council has adopted this resolution today to renew the mandate of the Sudan Panel of Experts for another 12 months. This resolution is an important statement underscoring this body continues to support the panel's independent reporting to shed light on the spiraling situation in Sudan. Renewal of the mandate for 12 months affords the panel the opportunity to make up the time it lost during the previous mandate due to the brutal conflict plaguing the country. We urge the Sudanese government and all relevant parties to allow the panel to conduct research and interviews on the ground over the next 12 months. The United States is confident this renewed mandate and the critical reporting it affords will enable action to stop movement of arms into Darfur and support efforts to end the ongoing conflict. We remain ready to work with and support the United Nations to advance peace and security in Sudan. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
Россия
воздержалась при голосовании по подготовленному США проекту резолюции о продлении мандата группы экспертов Санкционного комитета 1591 по Суданскому Дарфуру. Отрадно, что авторы частично пошли навстречу пожеланиям ряда делегаций, согласились почистить избыточный язык по политической ситуации, гуманитарным аспектам, правочеловеческой тематике. Авторы убеждали нас,
the political situation or the humanitarian situation. The authors told us that the Council could not remain impartial to the situation in Sudan, and so the text needed to be brought into account with the current realities on the ground. Ultimately, in a single day, we are adopting 2 resolutions on Sudan with overlapping content, particularly when it comes to humanitarian and human rights aspects. Is it worth thinking that if those calls can be made twice, they will become more convincing? Russia has no principal objections to the work done by the panel of experts. We believe that it should continue to do this effectively and in an unbiased way. At the same time, it's important for the group in its work to not go beyond the bounds of its mandate. Unfortunately, some of the provisions in this resolution could be interpreted specifically as an attempt to expand the mandate of the panel beyond Darfur, even though the sanctions regime is in effect only in respect of that part of Sudan. Moreover, from a point of view of principle, we believe there is no justification to extend the mandate of the panel of experts beyond the time frame of the sanctions regime itself, the renewal of which the Security Council still has to consider in September this year. This lack of coordination is not usual for the work of sanctions committees. We see this as an attempt by the US authors to prejudge the process and to impose upon members of the Council and Sudan their opinion of the fact that the effects of the sanctions regime should be extended. We would like to underscore that the decision in September will be taken taking into account the situation in Sudan and assessments of whether it is appropriate to preserve or withdraw the restrictions or to revise their parameters. And it certainly will not depend on the expiry date of the mandate of the panel of experts. The current shell game that they're playing should not be considered a precedent for the Council. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President,
中方对刚刚表决
China
的
abstained
决议草
on the
案
vote
投了弃权
on
票，
this resolution
愿简要阐
and
述中
wishes to
方有关立
elaborate
场。
on our position as follows.
中方始
Very
终主
briefly,
张安理会
China has
要
all along
以谨
insisted
慎
that
和
the
负
Security
责任的
Council
态
should
度
take
处
a
理
prudent
制裁
and
问题，
responsible approach
强
on the
调
issue
制
of
裁
sanctions.
是手
We
段，
emphasize
不是
that
目的。
sanctions are only a means to an
对
end,
制
not
裁
an end
措施
itself, and
要
must
及
be
时审
reviewed
查，
in a timely
该调
fashion
整的要调
and
整，
should
该
be
终止的
adjusted
要
or
终止。
terminated as appropriate.
我们很遗憾地看到
We，regret to see
刚才表
that
决的
the
决议
draft
草
resolution
案
we just
并没
voted
有
on
朝这个方向努力。
is not working in this
安理会
direction.
第2676
Council
号决议
Resolution
明确规定，
2676
对达尔
clearly
富尔的
provides
制裁措
that
施
the
将
sanctions
于
on
今年
Darfur
9月
are to
到期。
expire in September this year.
此次决议坚持
current
将制裁
resolution
委专家小组
Renewing
延期
the
到明年
mandate of
3
the
月，
Sudan panel
显然
of
是极
experts
不合理、
till March
自
next
相
year
矛盾的。
is apparently and
谢谢
utterly
主席。
unjustified and contradictory. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3, namely Algeria, Guyana, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Mozambique. The A3 would like to express its appreciation to the penholder for their tireless efforts in conducting the negotiation process and to garner support for this resolution when the views of the members of the Council seemed far apart. We believe more could have been done to better and fully reflect the views of all Council members in the text. Nevertheless, we recognize this is possibly the best compromise text we could achieve at this stage. We extend our appreciation to all Council members for their constructive engagement and their willingness to compromise, which allowed us to adopt the current resolution. Mr. President, the A3 Plus voted in favor of this resolution to reiterate its full support to the mandate of the panel of experts of the Committee 1591 regarding Darfur. We are extremely concerned in that connection about the situation on the ground, particularly the reports of attacks on civilians, violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, and sexual and gender-based violence, including targeted attacks on women and girls. Recent reports of proliferation of weapons and recruitment campaigns among civilian population, including children, are also of great concern. The information we received from the Secretary General yesterday leaves no doubt about the gravity of the situation and the risks it poses to the region. In this regard, Algeria, Guyana, Sierra Leone, and Mozambique encourage the panel to continue to implement its mandate, providing the committee with the information it needs to best assess and take action on the situation in Darfur. Today, perhaps more than ever, the panel's work is of great importance. To conclude, Mr. President, the A3 Plus stands ready to continue to constructively engage with the members of the Council towards peace and stability of the Sudan and Darfur. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. The 9,570th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Greece, Latvia, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Mr. Khaled Hiari, Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Asia, and Pacific Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, and Ms. Lisa Doughton, Director, Financing and Partnerships Division, Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of European Union to the United Nations, to participate in the meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Khaled Hiari.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, 2 weeks ago, the Secretary General joined this Council in marking 2 years since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launched in blatant violation of the UN Charter and international law. On this grim milestone, we heard a loud and clear message from the broad membership of the organization. The escalatory trajectory of this war and its enormous human costs are unsustainable and dangerous, particularly for Ukrainian civilians. In this Council and at the General Assembly, we heard numerous urgent calls for de-escalation, peace and respect for the principle of the UN Charter. However, the past 2 weeks have instead witnessed an intensification of attacks on civilians across different regions of Ukraine. Strikes have also been reported inside the Russian Federation, including today in the Belgorod region, reportedly leading to casualties. Regrettably, our repeated calls for protection of civilians appear to fall on deaf ears. Mr. President, the Ukrainian Black Sea port city of Odessa has become a frequent target of missile and drone attacks in recent days and weeks, with deadly consequences. 2 days ago, a Russian missile strike hit Odessa, reportedly killing 5 people and wounding several. Further drone attacks were reported last night. On Saturday, 2 March, 12 people were reportedly killed in a drone attack on an apartment block. 5 of those killed were children, making it the deadliest incident for children in more than 9 months. This heartbreaking incident followed 2 consecutive nights of drone attacks on 22nd and 23rd February that claimed the lives of 4 people. Since February 2022, Odessa, an important hub for Ukrainian agricultural exports, has also suffered repeated strikes on its infrastructure. The cultural heritage sites on the city have not been spared. Odessa is far from being the only Ukrainian city under constant fire. In recent days, civilian casualties have been reported in Kharkiv, Donetsk, Sumy, and Zaporizhzhia regions of Ukraine. Last night, 2 people were reportedly killed as a result of missile attacks on the city of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. Yesterday afternoon, a reported Russian missile strike on the city of Sumy injured 1 civilian, damaged the central city hospital and the region's emergency medical center. These are only a few of the recent incidents. We are particularly concerned by the reports that the fighting is spreading to new residential areas in the east of Ukraine. Throughout this war, fighting that came to Ukrainian villages, towns, and cities led to complete or near-complete destruction at the hands of Russian forces. This has been witnessed in Mariupol, Bakhmut, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, Volvonakha, and most recently in Adviivka. This horrific pattern must not be perpetuated. According to the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine has already resulted in the death of 10,703 civilians, including 594 children. 20,146 more, including 1,316 children, have been injured. We condemn all attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. They are prohibited under international law. They are unacceptable and must stop now. Mr. President, the Secretary General has emphasized in his recent remarks to this Council that territorial integrity and political independence of states are fundamental principles of the UN Charter. They are at the heart of our multilateral order. Therefore, the reports of the Russian Federation's plan to organize and hold its March presidential elections in the territories of Ukraine currently under its control are deeply disturbing. The attended illegal annexations of Ukrainian territory have no validity under international law, as also declared by the UN General Assembly. The United Nations remain fully committed to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, today is International Women's Day. I wish to pay tribute to the courageous Ukrainian women and girls who, despite the unspeakable horrors they have endured, continue to work to support their communities and to build a better future for their country. Yet, economic turmoil caused by the war is disproportionately affecting Ukrainian women's livelihood. Their well-being is at risk due to restricted access to essential services. They face heightened risk of sexual and gender-based violence. We continue to work to ensure that the needs of women and girls are addressed in our efforts to mitigate the impacts of the war. We are also committed to partnering with Ukrainian women leaders and women peace and security champions to promote women's full and equal participation in decision-making, recovery, and peace efforts. Mr. President, the past 2 years of war have come with a heavy price for Ukraine, Europe, and the world. We must now not allow for this war to bring further loss of life, destruction, and suffering. In the Secretary General's words, I quote, "It is high time for peace, a just peace based on the United Nations Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolution," end quote. The United Nations remain ready to support all meaningful efforts to this end. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Hiari for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Lisa Doughton.
Thank you, Mr. President. 2 years and 13 days have now passed since the full-scale escalation of this war. The latest wave of escalatory attacks in Odessa, Kharkiv, Sumy, Donetsk regions over the past few days shows how the conflict continues to inflict immeasurable human suffering, death, and devastation on the people of Ukraine. We were particularly appalled by the strike on the high-rise residential building in Odessa City this past weekend that, according to local authorities, killed 12 civilians, including 5 children. The recent attacks have left many other civilians without electricity, heat, and water. Multi-story apartment buildings have been damaged or destroyed by the impact of the strikes in cities and towns in Donetsk, Kherson, and Dnipro regions, rendering thousands homeless and in need of humanitarian assistance. Amid still cold winter temperatures, this damage is threatening the lives of the most vulnerable in particular, among them the elderly and those with disabilities. Many of these people have had to remain in frontline communities and are already suffering because of the disruption to essential services caused by the war. The UN Human Rights Office reports that nearly 31,000 civilians have now been killed or injured since 24 February 2022. This prompts me to repeat that attacks directed against civilians and civilian objects are prohibited under international humanitarian law. Indiscriminate attacks are also strictly prohibited. Parties to the conflict must take constant care to spare all civilians and civilian objects, including infrastructure essential for civilians' survival. On this International Women's Day, while we celebrate Ukrainian women as instrumental agents of change and honor the incredible work of Ukrainian women's organizations, we should also note the particularly harsh impact of the conflict on women and girls in Ukraine. The UN Population Fund reports a third of households led by women in Ukraine are struggling to feed themselves, and 60% of older women are unable to provide for their own basic needs. An increase in gender-based violence against women and girls has been a shocking hallmark of this war. Tragically, a lack of sufficient resources to sustain and expand a network of medical and social care services means that many of the 2.5 million people at risk of being subjected to gender-based violence in the coming year, notably acute for displaced women and girls near the front lines, will not have access to the services they need and deserve. Mr. President, the UN and its partners continue to do everything we can to provide humanitarian assistance to millions of people across Ukraine. This is in spite of the ongoing and deteriorating security situation. So far in 2024, 2 humanitarian workers have lost their lives and 10 have been injured, highlighting the dangers of delivering aid close to the front line. We're grateful to the donors who've so far provided 11% of the $3.1 billion needed for the 2024 Ukraine Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. This has enabled us to address the ongoing impacts of the conflict and provide life-saving assistance. But more financial support is urgently needed to sustain operations. In recent months, humanitarians have provided more than 1.7 million people with some form of direct winter assistance, including winter heating, repair and maintenance of energy and heating systems, and much-needed home repair materials. The commitment and endurance shown by some 600 partner organizations delivering a humanitarian response across Ukraine is remarkable. They are working in the middle of tremendous insecurity and danger to provide civilians with the services and supplies they need to see them through the harsh winter and beyond. So far in 2024, the UN and its partners have had to adapt their operations to stay and deliver to the people affected by the intensification of fighting along the front line, delivering critical supplies to the nearly 13,000 war-affected residents in the frontline communities through 11 interagency convoys. These convoys are a lifeline. Just last week, 2 much-needed interagency convoys reached communities in Kherson and Donetsk that have been heavily impacted by months of fighting. They delivered portable power stations, hygiene items, and other essential supplies. This interagency support is complemented by numerous deliveries from local organizations and volunteers. But, Mr. President, we continue to face significant obstacles to reaching everyone in need. One of the most significant challenges remains the lack of humanitarian access to the parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia oblasts occupied by the Russian Federation. As hostilities continue to escalate, we're deeply concerned about the fate of the civilians in these territories whom we're unable to reach at scale. The consequences for an estimated 1.5 million people in need of life-saving assistance are unthinkable, and they are unavoidable. They are avoidable. As we have been stating repeatedly, under international humanitarian law, all parties must allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, and must ensure that humanitarian personnel have the freedom of movement required for their work. This applies where civilians in need are located in Ukraine. Mr. President, the United Nations and its humanitarian partners remain committed to safeguarding the life and dignity of the people affected by this war for as long as it takes. But it has gone on far too long. It's time to bring the humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine and the suffering of the Ukrainian people to an end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Doughton for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
je remercie Monsieur Chiari
I'd like to
et
thank
Madame
Mr. Chiari and
Doughton
Madame
pour leurs
Doughton
exposés.
for their briefings.
Mercredi,
On
des
Wednesday,
missiles russes ont frappé la ville
Russian
d'Odessa,
missiles struck the city of
causant la mort
Odessa,
de 5
causing the
personnes.
death of 5 people.
Certains de ces missiles
Some of
se
these
sont abattus
missiles
à quelques
hit a
centaines
few
de mètres
hundred
du convoi
meters
qui transportait
away
le
from the
président
convoy
ukrainien
that
et
was
le Premier
transporting
ministre
the
grec,
Ukrainian president
alors
and
en
the Greek prime
déplacement
minister
dans cette ville.
as they were moving around in
Samedi
this city.
dernier, les
Last
attaques de
Saturday,
drones
drone
contre un
attacks
immeuble
against a
d'habitation
residential
avaient tué
building
12
killed
personnes,
12
dont
people,
5 enfants,
5 of them
et en avaient
children,
blessé 20
and
autres.
wounded 20 others.
Les autorités russes
The Russian
continuent de
authorities
bafouer le
continue
droit
to
international
flout international
humanitaire dans la
humanitarian
poursuite
law
de la guerre
as they
d'agression
pursue
illégale qu'elles
illegal
mènent
war of
depuis plus
aggression
de 2 ans
that they have been
contre
conducting
l'Ukraine.
now for more than
Le
2
bilan de
years
cette
against
guerre est
Ukraine.
désastreux
The
et
cost of
continue
this
de s'alourdir.
aggression is
On
disastrous and
dénombre
continues to
10
get worse.
500 civils tués
10,500
depuis le
civilians
début du
killed
conflit
since the beginning of the
et le nombre
conflict,
réel est
and the
sans
real
doute
number
bien
is
plus élevé.
undoubtedly higher.
Les frappes
The
conduites par
strikes
la
carried
Russie
out by Russia
contre les
against
infrastructures énergétiques
Ukrainian energy
ukrainiennes
infrastructure
au cœur de
in
l'hiver
the middle of
ont
winter
privé
have
des
deprived
centaines de villes et de
hundreds
villages
of towns
d'électricité.
and villages of
Plus de
electricity.
4 millions de
More than 4
personnes,
million
dont
people,
1 million
a million
d'enfants,
of them
ont été
children,
déplacés
have been
et plus
displaced,
de 17
and more
millions
than
ont
17
besoin
million
d'assistance
require
humanitaire.
humanitarian
La
assistance.
France est mobilisée pour
France
répondre aux
is
besoins. Elle a
mobilized to
engagé
respond
près de
to
300
the
millions d'euros
needs
d'aide
of the
depuis le début
Ukrainians.
du
We have
conflit.
committed
Elle a
almost 300
organisé plus
million
de 50
euro
opérations
in
pour
humanitarian aid since
acheminer
the
plusieurs
beginning of the
milliers de
conflict,
tonnes de
and we've
frais.
organized 50
Le
operations to
droit
deliver
international humanitaire
humanitarian freight.
interdit les
International
frappes contre les
humanitarian law
populations
prohibits strikes
et
against
infrastructures civiles qui ne
populations and civilian
participent pas
infrastructure
aux
when they
hostilités.
are not party
La
to the
France condamne
hostilities.
ces
France
violations du droit
condemns these
international
violations of
humanitaire
international
et elle exige que
humanitarian
les
law,
auteurs soient punis.
and we demand
La
that those
commission
responsible be
d'enquête
punished.
indépendante du Conseil des
The
droits de l'homme a
Independent Commission of
dénoncé les
Inquiry
attaques
of the Human
indiscriminées
Rights Council has
contre les
denounced the
populations
indiscriminate
et les
attacks
infrastructures
against the
essentielles de
population and
l'Ukraine.
essential infrastructure
La
of
Cour pénale
Ukraine.
internationale a émis le 5
Arrest
mars
warrants
des mandats
have been
d'arrêt
issued
contre
by
Sergei
the
Kobilak
International
et
Criminal Court
Viktor
on the 5th of March
Sokolov,
against Sergei
qui
Kobilak
sont
and
accusés
Viktor
de crimes de
Sokolov,
guerre et crimes
who are
contre
accused
l'humanité.
of war crimes and crimes
Monsieur le
against
Président,
humanity.
cette
Mr.
guerre
President,
cause des
this war
souffrances
of
bien
aggression
au-delà
is
des
creating
frontières de
suffering
l'Ukraine.
well beyond Ukraine's
Lorsque la
borders.
Russie frappe les
When Russia
infrastructures de
strikes
stockage et
storage and
d'exportation
export
de
infrastructure
céréales,
for
elle
cereals,
provoque une insécurité
it
alimentaire
provokes
qui
a
pèse
food
sur les populations
insecurity that
vulnérables
weighs heavily
du
on
monde
vulnerable
entier,
populations
notamment
throughout
des
the world,
pays en
particularly
développement.
in developing countries.
Pour répondre à cela, la
In order
France
to respond
continuera
to
de
this
soutenir
emergency,
les
France will continue
initiatives
to
visant
support
à permettre
initiatives
les
aimed
exportations de
at
céréales
enabling
ukrainiennes, comme
Ukrainian
les
cereal
corridors de
exports, such as
solidarité
the
ou
solidarity lanes
l'initiative
or
Grain
the
from
Grain from
Ukraine.
Ukraine
Monsieur le
initiative.
Président,
Mr. President,
après plus de 2 ans
after
d'agression,
more than
la
2 years of
Russie
aggression,
mise sur
Russia is
l'épuisement du
counting
peuple
on the
ukrainien et sur
exhaustion
la
of the
lassitude
Ukrainian people
de ceux qui
and
le soutiennent.
on
Elle n'y
those
parviendra
supporting
pas.
them growing weary.
Nous
This will not
continuerons
happen.
d'apporter un
We
soutien
continue to
politique,
provide
militaire
political,
et
military
humanitaire à
and
l'Ukraine
humanitarian
pour
support to
l'aider
Ukraine
dans l'exercice
in order to help
de son
them
droit à
to
la légitime
exercise their
défense.
right to
Nous
legitimate
continuerons
defense. We
d'appeler
will
la
continue
Russie à
to call
retirer
upon
ses
Russia
troupes
to
du
withdraw its
territoire
troops from
ukrainien,
Ukrainian
comme
territory,
l'a
as
demandé la Cour
demanded
internationale
by
de
the International
justice
Court of
dès le 16
Justice
mars
on the
2022.
16th of March
Nous resterons
2022.
mobilisés pour faire
We will
respecter
remain
les
mobilized
principes
to
de la
ensure
Charte des
respect
Nations
for the
Unies
principles of
qui
the
peuvent
United
seuls,
Nations Charter.
ici comme
It is
ailleurs,
they alone,
servir de
here and
base
elsewhere, which
pour
are
une
able
paix
to serve
juste
as
et
the
durable.
basis for a just
Je vous remercie.
and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco la exposición
I would like
informativa del
to thank
subsecretario
Assistant Secretary General
Khaled
Khaled Chiari
y de la directora
for
de
his
la OCHA,
informative
Lisa
briefing,
Doughton.
as well as Lisa Doughton,
Reconozco la
Director
presencia
of
en esta
OCHA,
sala de
and I
los
recognize the
representantes de Ucrania,
representatives in the room of
Grecia,
Ukraine,
Polonia,
Greece, Poland,
Letonia y la Unión Europea.
the European
Es
Union,
lamentable
and Latvia.
que a pesar de
It is
nuestros
unfortunate
esfuerzos
that despite
colectivos,
our collective
el
efforts,
Consejo deba
the
reunirse
Council
una vez
has
más
to meet
para
once
escuchar sobre los efectos devastadores de un conflicto que continúa despreciando la vida humana y el derecho internacional humanitario. Ha sido lamentable conocer sobre el reciente ataque ocurrido el 6 de marzo en Odessa, donde un golpe dirigido a la infraestructura portuaria resultó además en la trágica muerte de al menos 5 vidas civiles.
La coincidencia del ataque con la visita del primer ministro griego, Mitsotakis, subraya la imprudencia con la que se desafían las normas internacionales y se debilita la diplomacia. Este hecho merece nuestro más enérgico rechazo. Este incidente representa además un golpe a las arterias vitales de una ciudad que desempeña un papel crucial para la economía de Ucrania y la región. Atacar infraestructuras críticas, además de ser una violación directa del derecho internacional, tiene un efecto dominó que afecta a personas inocentes, exacerbando la crisis humanitaria y poniendo en peligro la seguridad alimentaria mundial. El Ecuador reitera su llamado urgente a que cesen los ataques contra la población y contra la infraestructura civil e insiste en la responsabilidad de las partes de respetar irrestrictamente sus obligaciones que derivan del derecho internacional humanitario, incluyendo los principios de distinción, proporcionalidad y precaución. El continuo derramamiento de sangre y la destrucción que este conflicto causa no solo afecta a la población civil en Ucrania y en Rusia, sino que eleva el riesgo de una escalada mayor del conflicto, con posibles repercusiones que amenazan gravemente la seguridad global. Cada acto de violencia, cada declaración inflamatoria, cada ataque a la infraestructura civil, cada vida perdida, nos acercan peligrosamente a un punto de no retorno, en el que las posibilidades de una solución pacífica se desvanecen. La historia nos ha enseñado una y otra vez que los conflictos armados no tienen ganadores. La única vía hacia una resolución duradera es a través de la mesa de negociaciones y de la diplomacia. Reiteramos el llamado a la Federación Rusa a que ponga fin a sus operaciones militares en Ucrania, tal como lo dispuso la Corte Internacional de Justicia en marzo del 2022. El mundo cuenta con nuestra capacidad para superar los conflictos. Deben utilizarse todos los medios disponibles para avanzar hacia una paz justa y duradera sobre la base de los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Mr. President, I also thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari and Director Doughton for their briefings. Mr. President, the United States condemns in the strongest terms the Russian aerial assaults on cities and critical infrastructure across Ukraine. On March 6, Russia's strikes against the port city of Odessa were another stark reminder of how Russia is unleashing daily destructive attacks against Ukraine's people and infrastructure. Unfortunately, attacks against Odessa are not new. Last weekend, reports indicated that Russian strikes hit a high-rise residential building, leaving 12 dead and 20 injured. Among those killed were 5 children, one of whom was only 7 months old. Reports indicate that at least 5 civilians were killed on March 6. We mourn this tragic loss of life. Every civilian death in conflict, no matter where in the world it occurs, is a tragedy. This time, when the air raid siren sounded, the President of Ukraine and the Prime Minister of Greece were reviewing the profound devastation in Odessa as a result of months of sustained bombardment. Russia's strike hit a few hundred meters from their convoy. Mr. President, Russia's attempts to justify the unjustifiable today do not change simple facts: that Russia continues to conduct a war of aggression against another sovereign UN member state in violation of the Charter, that Ukraine would not need to call for urgent meetings of this Council if Russia would cease its aggression, that Ukrainian civilians are suffering daily death and destruction as a result of the Kremlin's attempts to conquer and subjugate their country. Mr. President, we must not forget that after Russia suspended its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, depriving some of the world's most food-insecure countries of Ukraine's grain, the Kremlin did not stop there. It launched more attacks on Odessa's ports, infrastructure, and grain storage. These attacks were not only cruel, they were part of a campaign to decimate Ukraine's economy after failing to defeat its military. In those strikes, Russia destroyed more than 300,000 tons of grain and vital storage facilities. Ukraine responded with resiliency and creativity, launching a humanitarian corridor that brought Ukraine's exports back to numbers not seen since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. Russia is not only attacking food infrastructure, but also energy infrastructure. Earlier this week, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Sergei Kobylash, former commander of the long-range aviation of the Aerospace Force, and Viktor Sokolov, commander of the Black Sea Fleet, for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in connection with Russia's attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. At every turn, the Kremlin chooses the path of war and escalation. It doubles down on nuclear saber-rattling and brazenly procures ballistic missiles and other munitions from the DPRK in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Colleagues, the United States will continue to stand with Ukraine and call for accountability. The path forward is clear. Russia must cease its attacks against Ukraine and immediately and fully withdraw from all territory within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I thank ASG Chiari and Ms. Doughton for their briefing today. You see who we are dealing with. They don't care where to hit. Words spoken by the President of Ukraine on Wednesday, which could have been spoken on countless occasions during this war. We are compelled to gather again to respond to another appalling series of missile attacks on Ukraine. On the 2nd of March, 12 civilians, including 5 children, died when debris hit an apartment block in Odessa. One of the victims was a baby, only 4 months old. On the 6th of March, as President Zelensky and Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis paid their respects to the dead, a further Russian strike hit the city. While they narrowly escaped the impact, 5 others were not so lucky. President, we've met too often in this chamber to address the human suffering Russia has inflicted upon Ukraine. This week, it was attacks on residential buildings. In other weeks, it has been hospitals, schools, train stations, hotels, restaurants. Each time, it is innocent Ukrainian civilians who pay the price with their lives. The day before this latest strike, the International Criminal Court announced 2 new indictments of senior Russian military figures for an alleged campaign of strikes against Ukraine's electricity infrastructure. These are not the actions of a country that is interested in peace. Putin claims that he launched this war to protect Ukrainian civilians. In fact, he is terrorizing them. Russia's actions show an utter disregard for international law and the UN Charter. It is attempting to intimidate Ukraine, its people, and those who support Ukraine. It will not succeed. Russia's previous attacks on Odessa have utterly failed. Ukraine has now driven much of the Black Sea Fleet from Crimea and is exporting the highest volumes from its ports since the war began. As my Defence Secretary said in Kyiv yesterday, the UK's support remains unwavering, and we will provide an additional £325 million to help Ukraine defend itself. Ukrainians have shown that they will not be bullied into submission, and Russia should know that the UK stands proudly by their side. And so we repeat our call again to Russia. Withdraw your troops, cease the bloodshed and endless, senseless war. Ukraine deserves a just and lasting peace that respects its territorial integrity. And with our support, that is what Ukraine will achieve. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also want to thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari and Director Doughton for the briefings. Mr. President, let me make a couple of points in the name of my delegation. First, the city of Odessa remains one of the most besieged cities in the war on Ukraine. Russian aerial attacks increased dramatically since July last year after Russia stepped away from the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The port city was subject to over 1,000 drone and missile attacks since then. These attacks are so regular, they have grown into events that are completely overseen by the international community. Air raid sirens turn on, drones or missiles appear, infrastructure gets reduced to rubble, and civilians buried underneath. At the end, sites of attacks are covered with flowers, candles, and toys. And the vicious cycle repeats itself the next day. So this has to stop. We cannot allow this to become the ordinary life for the inhabitants of Ukrainian cities such as Odessa. We cannot forget blatant violations of international law. We cannot tolerate indiscriminate use of high explosive weaponry in densely populated areas. Second, last Wednesday we have witnessed another low point of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. In Odessa, a Russian missile landed a couple hundred meters away from leaders of two sovereign nations. While we are relieved that no harm was done to them, civilians died in the strike, and we are appalled by this, and we condemn it in the strongest possible terms. This represents another episode in this unnecessary war, where explosive weaponry is used indiscriminately in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. The Security Council needs to start fulfilling its primary responsibility and ensure prompt and effective action in order to bring back peace and security to Ukraine and wider region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, we are grateful to Mr. Khaled Chiari, Assistant Secretary General, and Ms. Lisa Doughton, Director at WACHA, for their important and insightful briefings. Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, the Council convened in this chamber to mark the 2-year milestone of this ongoing conflict. At the time, Mozambique raised deep concerns about the ominous escalation of the war, highlighting its severe economic, political, and humanitarian consequences. We advocated in our statement the need for a significant shift in our approach to finding a settlement by emphasizing the pivotal role of diplomacy. Regrettably, the recent spate of attacks has only served to push the prospect of detente even further away. Our apprehensions regarding the escalation of this conflict have been warranted lately. Clearly, the signals of escalatory attitudes will further undermine the security and stability in Europe and in the world. They will heighten the threat of retaliatory use of tactical nuclear weapons. We should not embrace positions that mark distance from the United Nations Charter that compel all members to settle international disputes by peaceful means, even in a situation of conflict. Mr. President, history, and recent history for that matter, has shown us that even in times of confrontation and a nuclear threat, there are opportunities for a strong leadership to avert the descent into further conflict, to thread back into the path of dialogue and peace. We need to resort to the constructive spirit that more than 30 years ago saw European countries committed to build on their continent a common house and a peaceful space. This spirit of cooperation and negotiation is critically needed today. Mozambique remains committed to advocating a diplomatic solution to end this war. We encourage that all avenues be explored, including the reestablishment of diplomatic channels, the exchange of prisoners, and the leveraging of the good offices of the Secretary General. We have always believed that genuine, constructive, and responsible dialogue is the correct path to resolving this conflict. In light of this, Mozambique reiterates its call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. We urge a return to direct negotiations between the parties as a matter of high priority. As the Secretary General eloquently stated in our last meeting, the problem has been a disregard for the charter that abhors the scourge of war. Honoring the letter and the spirit of the charter is the correct solution. It is therefore time to recommit ourselves to the charter and renew our respect for international law as the pathway to international peace and security. Today, 8th of March, International Women's Day, Mozambique wishes to pay tribute to women in the world, and particularly in those areas of conflict where women are working hand in hand with men for international peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank ASG Kerry and Ms. Doughton for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of Ukraine, European Union, Greece, Poland, and Latvia delegation at today's meeting. Ever since we solemnly commemorated the second anniversary of Russia's illegal invasion against Ukraine last month, we have witnessed Russia intensifying its missile and drone attacks against Ukraine cities. Such attacks are claiming civilian lives and inflicting damage on civilian infrastructures, such as residential buildings, schools, hospitals, and granaries. These include the deadly missile strike on Odessa, Ukraine's key port city, just 2 days ago, while the Prime Minister of Greece and the President of Ukraine were visiting. This extremely dangerous missile attack reportedly took place just a few hundred meters away from the two leaders' convoy. Regardless of the account that Russia provides, we cannot overlook the grave implication of this incident. By putting leaders in danger, these kinds of attacks unnecessarily lead to further escalation in the context of an already perilous regional situation. These unjustifiable wars' impacts have already created untold human suffering, in addition to various ripple effects at the global level. And we cannot afford any further spread of this conflict. It is alarming to see this war getting further protracted and escalated. Mr. President, my delegation believes that the international community's commitments to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity is unwavering. And this unwavering commitment has been reaffirmed here in the United Nations, as we vividly remember that an overwhelming majority of the General Assembly adopted a resolution on a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine last year. We reiterate that the only way to achieve this goal is for Russia to withdraw its military forces from the territory of Ukraine. The flagrant violations of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity must cease immediately. Protracted conflict not only means immediate losses and damages. Prolonged and accumulated destruction and suffering will make recoveries even harder in the long term. In this context, we note the alarming estimation of the recent rapid damage and needs assessments jointly released by Ukraine, the World Bank Group, the European Commission, and the United Nations. The total cost of reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine amounts to $486 billion over the next decades, which is equivalent to the 2.5 times of Ukraine's current GDP. Through its own experience of the devastating consequences of the war, the Korean people are acutely aware of how tortuous and painstaking the course of reconstruction is. This is why the Republic of Korea is firmly committed to working with the international community to support reconstruction's efforts in Ukraine. On the top of $140 million in humanitarian assistance already provided to Ukraine, we will deliver a comprehensive aid packages of $2.3 billion over the upcoming years to help the Ukrainian people rebuild their nation. My government is also actively participating in the multi-agency donor coordination platform for Ukraine to better coordinate collective assistance among major donor countries. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also thank Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kiari and Director Leeson Doughton for the updates provided. Guyana deeply regrets that civilian lives continue to be lost in this ongoing war in Ukraine. We deplore the recent attacks, including in the city of Odessa, which claimed the lives of several civilians, including young children, and caused widespread damage to civilian infrastructure. This war continues to inflict immeasurable suffering and destruction, with women and children bearing the brunt of the increasingly tense bombardments. OCHA has reported that the humanitarian situation in frontline communities, including the territories occupied by the Russian Federation, is reaching severe and catastrophic levels, with more than 3.3 million people, including 800,000 children requiring emergency assistance. The organization has also documented the damage and destruction wrought during the past year, including of homes, hospitals, schools, and vital civilian infrastructure. These cannot be allowed to continue. Guyana reiterates its call for an end to attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We urge the parties to the conflict to immediately cease all indiscriminate attacks and to take every measure possible to protect civilians. We further demand that they honor their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and to guarantee protection for those who are most vulnerable. We further stress the urgency of resolving this conflict through peaceful means and encourage the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict and the continued engagement of the international community to this end. In closing, Mr. President, Guyana reaffirms its support for full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And as we commemorate International Women's Day, we salute those women in Ukraine and Russia who are working for peace, and we express our solidarity with those who are grieving for their loved ones lost. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, first of all, I would like to thank ASG Chiari and Ms. Dalton for their briefings. As the Ukraine crisis drags on, aggravated attacks and civilian casualties continue to occur, and humanitarian situation keeps worsening. Today's briefings once again demonstrate the cruelty of the war and the severity of the situation. China is deeply concerned and saddened about this. Conflict and confrontation produce no winner. All conflicts have to end at the negotiating table. The earlier the talks start, the sooner peace will arrive. Only when all parties uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and properly address each other's legitimate concerns can Europe truly establish a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture. We call on all parties to remain calm and exercise restraint, enhance direct engagement and dialogue, gradually build consensus, and collectively explore viable solutions. The international community should also increase diplomatic efforts to facilitate de-escalation of the situation and create conditions for a political settlement. On the Ukraine issue, China always holds an objective and just position and has never given up efforts to facilitate talks for peace. At present, the special representative of the Chinese government on Eurasian affairs are conducting mediation visits to Russia, Ukraine, and relevant European countries to seek a political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. China supports the holding in due course of an international peace conference that is recognized by both Russia and Ukraine and ensures the equal participation of all parties and fair discussions on all peace plans. We're ready to continue communication and engagement with all parties to consolidate consensus for ending the conflict and paving the way for dialogue and peace talk while making tireless efforts and playing a constructive role in facilitating a political solution to the crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie le sous-secrétaire général
Assistant Secretary General Mohamed Khaled Chiari and Director Lisa Doughton of OCHA
Alors
for
que
their
nous sommes
presentations.
entrés dans la troisième
As
année
we
de
have entered
l'agression
the third year
militaire de
of
la
Russia's
Russie contre
military aggression
l'Ukraine,
against Ukraine,
la réunion d'aujourd'hui
today's
est un
meeting
rappel
is a
de son
reminder
impact
of its
dévastateur sur la
devastating impact
population
on the
civile.
civilian population.
La Suisse continue de
Switzerland
déplorer le
continues to
coût humain
deplore
et
the
les
human
immenses
cost
souffrances
and
causées
immense
par cette
suffering
guerre.
caused by this war.
Chaque jour où les
Every day,
hostilités se
the
poursuivent,
hostilities
le nombre de
continue,
victimes
the
civiles
number of civilian
augmente, à
casualties
l'instar des
rises,
événements de la
as the
semaine
events of
écoulée.
the past week have shown.
Nous sommes troublés
We
par
are disturbed by the
l'intensification des attaques de
intensification
missiles
of
et de
Russian
drones
missile
russes
and
au
drone
cours de ces
attacks
derniers
in
jours
recent
et les
days and
dernières
weeks.
semaines. En fin de semaine dernière, plusieurs régions de l'Est et du Sud de l'Ukraine, dont Donetsk, Mykolaiv et Kharkiv, ont été attaquées, faisant de nouvelles victimes et causant d'importants dégâts à des bâtiments résidentiels et à d'autres infrastructures civiles, dont un hôpital et des écoles. Les attaques perpétrées à Odessa samedi dernier, et il y a 2 jours, lors de la visite du président Zelensky et du premier ministre Mitsotakis, ont été tragiques. Comme nous l'avons entendu, 12 personnes ont été tuées lors de la première attaque, dont plusieurs enfants. Il ne s'agit là que des derniers exemples d'attaques contre la ville qui a subi d'énormes dégâts après des mois de frappes russes, détruisant et endommageant plusieurs sites culturels importants, ainsi que des infrastructures portuaires et des silos à grains. Ceci nous rappelle à quel point cette guerre, au travers de son impact sur la sécurité alimentaire, a des conséquences délétères à travers le monde. Monsieur le Président, la Suisse condamne la nouvelle série d'attaques qui a fait de nombreuses victimes civiles. Ces attaques doivent cesser immédiatement. Nous réitérons notre appel au respect du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. Le droit international humanitaire interdit les attaques contre les civils, y compris contre les enfants, qui doivent être protégés à tout moment. Nous réitérons l'importance de la lutte contre l'impunité pour les crimes les plus graves et soutenons les efforts nationaux, régionaux et internationaux en matière de responsabilité, y compris ceux de la Cour pénale internationale qui a récemment délivré des mandats d'arrêt supplémentaires pour crimes de guerre et crimes contre l'humanité présumés. J'exprime également ma gratitude pour le travail des acteurs humanitaires qui ont réagi rapidement aux attaques, y compris dans la ville d'Odessa. Leur travail, qu'il s'agisse des premiers secours, du soutien psychologique ou de la distribution des urgences, reste indispensable et doit être protégé. Enfin, la Suisse reste engagée en faveur d'une paix globale, juste et durable en Ukraine, conformément aux principes de la Charte de l'ONU. Dans l'intérêt de la protection de la population civile, une telle paix doit rester notre objectif principal. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this briefing. Let me also thank the briefers, ASG Khalid Kiai and Director Lisa Dottin, for the information provided. I welcome the presence of and participation of the representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Sierra Leone continues to express grave concern about the continuing regrettable situation created in Ukraine by the conflict, with its continuing serious ramifications for international peace and security. In all the meetings on this regrettable conflict, we will reiterate our call for the full respect of the United Nations Charter and the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and for the immediate cessation of the hostilities. In so doing, we urge for good faith diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict, addressing the legitimate concerns of all parties to the conflict. Mr. President, turning to recent incidents for which today's briefing has been convened, we take note of reports of missile strikes, including in the Black Sea port of Odessa, while the Greek Prime Minister, Kyrios Mitsotakis, and the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, were visiting, with tragic fatalities and damage to vital infrastructure. It is deeply concerning that instead of cessation of hostilities, we observe signals of a more dangerous escalation of the conflict. Given this serious situation, Sierra is firmly of the view that time is now for the parties to the conflict and other involved parties to persist and commit to commencing meaningful constructive dialogue and seek a path to a peaceful resolution. There is need for a ceasefire initiative for the people of Ukraine and those affected in Russia. Furthermore, and regrettably, as the hostilities continue, we reiterate our call for the parties to comply with their obligations under international law, in particular international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian objects must be protected at all times. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine continues to have devastating consequences, not only for the parties to the conflict, but for the region and beyond. There are persistent, far-reaching effects on the global economy. On International Women's Day, we wish to highlight the growing cost of the conflict on women. According to UN Women, from heightened trafficking and gender-based violence to the loss of crucial livelihoods and rising poverty levels, women and girls of Ukraine are facing severe impacts. The large-scale destruction of infrastructure has left survivor service, healthcare, and other critical forms of support out of reach for many. Today, protecting civilians and providing humanitarian aid should remain an imperative. Human rights abuses, including reported allegations of sexual violence, must be investigated with accountability for the survivors. As women continue to bear different and additional burdens of conflict, they must be represented in all decision-making platforms on de-escalation, conflict prevention, mitigation, and other processes in pursuit of peace and security for all. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reiterating a call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities, a ceasefire initiatives, and the parties to the conflict to engage constructively in good faith in order to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, the entire world is marking a great holiday, International Women's Day. As you know, in our country, since the times of the Soviet Union, we have a firm basis of real rather than declaratory equality and equal professional opportunities for women. And however Western colleagues might try to spoil this day with their fake news about Russia for the sake of circulating which they convened this meeting, I would nevertheless like to congratulate all of the women around the world, including the colleagues on the Security Council, on International Women's Day, and wish them prosperity and professional successes, not through words, but actually in actions. You are making a contribution to international peace and security. Mr. President, repeatedly with specific examples we have proven that high-precision strikes by the Russian aerospace forces on targets in Ukraine linked to the military potential of the Kiev regime bear no danger for the civilians of that country that are not present at those objects. That is well known by ordinary Ukrainians who have repeatedly been able to see that their lives are threatened exclusively by the work of the unprofessional Ukrainian air defense systems that are also deployed, among other places, in residential districts of Ukrainian cities in violation of IHL norms. We all recall how an air defense missile that went off course destroyed the Spaso-Preobrazhensky Cathedral in Odessa. These errant missiles or debris have damaged residential buildings in Kiev, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, and Odessa, and other Ukrainian cities. I'll repeat, ordinary Ukrainians know this, and the nature of this destruction, as anyone who knows the slightest bit about modern armaments will tell you, do not allow you to suppose that these are instances of direct missile strikes. However, the representatives of the Kiev regime and the Western puppet masters with maniacal and baffling insistence are trying to present the results of the air defenses of the Kiev regime as targeted strikes by us on civilian targets. Achieving this impossible task is also the aim of today's meeting. Distinguished colleagues, from the 2nd to the 8th of March, the armed forces of Russia did indeed launch 34 group strikes with high-precision weapons, multiple launch rocket systems, and unmanned aerial vehicles on targets in Ukraine that were involved in the assembly and preparation for combat use of unmanned boats, arsenals, fuel depots for military hardware, the deployment locations of UAF units, formations of nationalists, and foreign mercenaries. As is confirmed by data from objective monitoring and as is also indicated by numerous posts from Ukrainian users on social networks, all of the stated targets were hit successfully. In those clips that you can easily find on the internet, you can see very clearly how, as a result of the haphazard firing of Ukrainian air defense systems from residential districts, missiles and shells are hitting areas that weren't being shelled. What's also telling are the comments of users under those and other posts saying that people shouldn't be afraid of they should be afraid of unpredictable air defenses rather than Russian
Эта тема
missiles.
попадает даже в
And that
репортажи
subject is
западных
also being
телеканалов,
included in the reports of
которым
Western
становится
TV
все сложнее
channels.
скрывать
It's
правду
becoming
о
harder for
происходящем.
them to hide the truth
Так,
about what's
в ходе
going on.
репортажа
So
CNN
during
из
a CNN
ожидающего
report
освобождения
from
города
the
Часов Яр
impending liberation of
прозвучало
Chasov
следующее
Yar,
эмоциональное
the following
признание одной из
emotional
его
admission was
жительниц.
heard from one of the residents
Цитирую.
of that town, and I quote,
Украинские военные забирают
Ukrainian
всю
soldiers
воду,
are taking all of the
подъезжают
water.
прямо
They're
к
coming
домам,
directly up
где
to
живут
people's
мирные жители,
buildings and
и
homes where
стреляют прямо из
civilians are
дома.
living. They're firing directly
Они
from those
прячутся за
buildings,
спинами
and they're
мирных.
hiding behind the backs of civilians.
Конец цитаты.
End quote.
Из этого же репортажа
From that
становится
same
понятно, что
report, it
остающиеся
becomes
в Часовом
clear
Яре жители
that
с
the
нетерпением ждут
residents still
российских
in
войск.
Chasov Yar
И это
are eagerly
понятно.
awaiting the arrival of
Ситуация,
Russian
когда
forces, and it's
подразделения
clear why
укронацистов
a
прикрываются
situation
мирными
in which
жителями как живым щитом,
units of Ukrainian
заставляет
nationalists are
переосмыслить
hiding behind
ценности даже
civilians
самых
as a
убежденных
human
сторонников
shield, is
режима
forcing even the
Зеленского.
most convinced supporters of the Zelensky regime to rethink their
Однако
values.
слепыми и глухими к этим
However,
сигналам остаются наши
our
западные
Western
коллеги,
colleagues remain blind
пока
and deaf
еще
to
не
these
теряющие
signals.
надежду на то,
They
что
have still not
воюющий
lost
за
the
их
hope
интересы киевский
that the
режим
Kiev regime
сможет
that is fighting
противостоять
for their
армии
interests
России.
will be able to resist the army of Russia.
Правда, ставки уже сильно
It's true,
понижены,
the stakes have
и
already
вместо
been lowered
призывов
significantly,
помочь
and
победить
instead of
Украине мы
calls
все
for
чаще
helping
слышим
Ukraine
заклинания
win,
о
we're
том, что
increasingly
нельзя
hear
допустить победы
exhortations that
России.
Russia mustn't be allowed to win.
Однако в условиях, когда
However, in
инициатива на
conditions in
фронте
which the
полностью
initiative
перешла
on
к
the front
российской
line
армии,
has fully
вопрос
shifted to
состоит
the
лишь в
Russian
том,
army, the
что
question is
готовы
only
предпринять западные
what
спонсоры
the Western
Зеленского и его клики,
sponsors of
чтобы
Zelensky and
попытаться
his
спасти
clique are
свой
willing to do
геополитический
to try
проект по
and
созданию
save their geopolitical
антироссии
project
на
to
наших
create an
границах от
anti-Russia
полного
on our
коллапса.
borders, to save it from total
Поставок
collapse.
оружия тут явно
Weapon
недостаточно.
supplies are
Как
clearly
выяснилось за
not
последние
enough,
дни,
as has become
хваленые
clear in
американские
recent days.
Абрамсы
The
горят
vaunted
не
American
хуже
Abrams
зарекламированных
burn
немецких
just as well
леопардов.
as the heavily promoted German
Примерно так
Leopards
же,
do.
как в степях Украины
Almost as
80
well
лет
as in the
назад горели
steppes
их
of Ukraine
предшественники,
80 years
немецкие
ago,
тигры
their
и пантеры.
predecessors burned, the German tigers and panthers.
Совершенно очевидно, что
It's
никакие
entirely
новые
clear
поставки
that no
оружия на
new
Украину
arms supplies to
агонию
Ukraine will
обанкротившегося
end
киевского
the
режима не
agony
остановит.
of the bankrupt
Они
Kiev
могут лишь
regime. They
растянуть
can
ее по
only
времени
drag it
ценой
out
жизни
at the
десятков, если
cost
не
of
сотен
tens,
тысяч
if not
украинцев.
hundreds of thousands of
Тех
Ukrainians'
самых,
lives.
которых киевская
The
власть
lives of those same
сейчас
people
всеми
that the
способами
Kiev
отлавливает на
authorities are
улице
now doing
и
everything they
бросает
can
бессмысленную
to
мясорубку.
round up on the streets and throw
Ведь
into
на
this
кону
senseless
выживание
slaughter.
режима Зеленского
What
и
is at
престиж
stake is
тех,
the
кто
survival
стоял
of
за
the Zelensky regime and the
антиконституционным
prestige of
переворотом
those
в
who were
Киеве
behind
10
the
лет назад.
anti-constitutional coup d'etat in Kiev 10 years ago.
Подобная перспектива, судя по всему,
This
вызывает у ряда
prospect, by all
безответственных
accounts, is making
европейских
a number
политиков
of
желание
irresponsible
добиваться
European
эскалации
politicians
украинского
want to
конфликта,
escalate the
выведения
Ukrainian
его на
conflict,
новый уровень,
to
уже
take
не
it to a new
опосредованного,
level
а
of no
прямого
longer
столкновения
proxy,
России и
but a
НАТО.
direct confrontation between Russia
Сложно
and
толковать
NATO.
иначе
It's
позицию
hard to
французского
interpret any
президента
other way the
Макрона о
position of French
необходимости
President
введения
Macron
войск
regarding
Альянса
the
на
need to send
Украину
alliance
для
forces to
предотвращения
Ukraine
краха
to
киевского
prevent the
режима.
collapse of the Kiev regime.
Жаль, что мы
It's
ничего не
a shame
услышали
that
об
we
этих
didn't hear
задумках,
anything about
грозящих
these
началом
ideas
Третьей мировой
that
войны,
threaten the
в
beginning of a
выступлении
third world
представителя
war in the
Франции.
statement by the representative of France.
Жаль также, что
It's
мы
also a
не видим
shame
среди
that
запросившихся выступить
among
на
those who
сегодняшнем заседании
requested to speak at
обычно
today's
весьма
meeting,
активного
we can't
представителя
see the
Германии.
usually active representative
Было
of
бы
Germany.
интересно услышать
It
его
would be
комментарии в
interesting
связи с
to hear his
утекшим
comments in
СМИ
relation to the
разговором
leak to the
высокопоставленных
media
немецких
of a
военных,
conversation between high-level
рассуждавших о том,
German
как помочь
military
украинцам
officials
разрушить
discussing
Керченский
how
мост
to
в Крым
help Ukrainians destroy the
и
Kerch
наносить
bridge to
удары вглубь
Crimea
территории России.
and launch strikes deep into
В
Russian
ходе этого же
territory.
разговора мы
During
услышали
that same
подтверждение
discussion,
того,
we
что
heard a
американские,
confirmation
британские
of the
и
fact that
европейские
American,
военные
British and
советники
European military
непосредственно
advisors
находятся на
are
Украине и
directly
помогают
located in
ВСУ
Ukraine and
выбирать цели
helping
для
the
удара.
UAF choose targets for their strikes.
То есть подтвердилось то, о чем мы давно
Confirmation then
говорили.
of what we've been
Каждое
talking about for
использование
a long
западного
time.
дальнобойного
Every
оружия
use of
против
Western
мирного
long-range
населения делает
weaponry
его
against the civilian
поставщиков
population
соучастниками
makes
этих
the suppliers
нарушающих МГП
complicit
преступлений
in these
Зеленского и
crimes
его
of
клики.
Zelensky and his clique that violate IHL.
Благодаря расследованию
Thanks
Нью-Йорк
to
Таймс
the
мы
New York
также
Times
узнали, узнали, что проект «Украина» является крупнейшей операцией ЦРУ в истории, начавшейся задолго до 2014 года, а также о том, что сразу после госпереворота на российской границе появились мощнейшие разведывательные станции ЦРУ. Жаль, что в своем выступлении представитель США поскромничал и ничего нам об этом не рассказал. Да и в целом было бы неплохо, если бы натовские представители в Совбезе разъяснили нам лукавую логику Альянса. Сначала его лидеры говорили нам о том, что НАТО должна расшириться на Украину, потому что Россия не станет нападать на страну-члена НАТО. Сегодня же мы слышим, что нельзя дать России одержать победу на Украине, потому что после этого она двинется дальше и нападет на НАТО. Где хоть какой-то здравый смысл в ваших высказываниях, господа, и хоть какая-то последовательность? Впрочем, о она красноречиво проявляется в том, как вы лепите из России образ врага и агрессора, опуская факты о том, что ваша агрессия против России задействованием Украины началась как минимум 10 лет назад. Обо всех этих нелицеприятных для наших западных коллег моментах мы подробно поговорим на запрошенном нами на 22 марта отдельном заседании Совета Безопасности. Господин председатель, как гласит известная турецкая пословица, когда клоун переезжает жить во дворец, он не становится королем. Зато дворец становится цирком. Можно было бы, конечно, воспринимать все происходящее на Украине как цирк, если бы последствия не были столь трагичными и катастрофическими для этого государства. Но цирковые номера в нем все-таки весьма популярны. Все мы знаем о воздушных сиренах, звучащих в Киеве и других городах во время визитов высокопоставленных зарубежных делегаций в отсутствии каких-либо обстрелов. Это уже стало своего рода частью цирковой программы пребывания иностранных лидеров на Украине. Что примечательно, в Одессе, по военным объектам, которые действительно наносился удар во время приезда в этот город высокопоставленной греческой делегации, сирена не прозвучала. Такого номера в цирковой программе не значилось. Хочу призвать всех тех, кто сегодня нагнетал и еще будет нагнетать страсти из-за этого эпизода, задать себе простой вопрос. Неужели вы и правда думаете, что если бы мы действительно хотели попасть по кортежу Зеленского, мы бы этого не смогли сделать? И постарайтесь на него ответить только честно. Особенно с учетом того, что вы прекрасно знаете о том, что этим ударом был уничтожен цех по производству морских беспилотников, а точнее их сборки из поставляемых в Великобритании компонентов. Для нас эта цель гораздо важнее, чем мечущийся по прифронтовой зоне Зеленский, делающий селфи в городах перед тем, как их освобождает российская армия. А если кто-то из вас в душе надеется избавиться таким образом от главаря киевского режима, то могу вас разочаровать. Наши планы — это не входит. Реинкарнацию господина Голобородько из сериала «Слуга народа» избрали на президентство украинцы, поверив его предвыборным обещаниям об установлении мира на Донбассе и защите русского языка и русскоговорящих граждан Украины. Он своих избирателей обманул. Вот пусть теперь с ним разбираются украинцы и его западные кукловоды. У нас есть задача поважнее — выполнение целей нашей специальной военной операции. И поскольку разговаривать о том, как их реализовать мирными средствами, вы не хотите, мы вынуждены использовать для этого средства военные, со всеми вытекающими последствиями для Украины и западных спонсоров киевского режима, которые уже начали весьма отчетливо проступать. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank ASG Kari and Ms. Doughton for their important briefings, and I welcome the participation of the Ukrainian PR in our meeting today. On 6 March, the official delegations of Ukraine and Greece, headed by the President of Ukraine and the Prime Minister of Greece, respectively visited the Ukrainian city of Odessa. Talks were aimed to discuss assistance in restoring civilian infrastructure. These include churches, educational institutions, and cultural heritage sites in Ukraine that were damaged or destroyed in Russia's war of aggression. While this visit was taking place, the city was attacked with deadly explosives, including in the nearby port facility. Repeatedly, Russian forces showed indifference as to whether targets were military or civilian. Since last week, we have seen a significant escalation in violence in Ukraine. Russian forces have increased their brutal attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in the port city of Odessa, destroying residential buildings and damaging other essential facilities. Sadly, 12 citizens, including 5 children, were killed in an attack on 2nd March. Further civilian casualties due to Russia's aerial attacks were also reported in the Kherson and Donetsk regions. We underscore once again that attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. They are unacceptable and must stop immediately. The civilian population has suffered immensely during this brutal war and must be protected by all means. These actions against civilians are deeply troubling and unacceptable. Malta strongly condemns these continuous heinous attacks and we express our deepest condolences to the families of the victims. Let us be clear. The persistent nature of these attacks and the escalating violence resulting in civilian casualties demonstrates Russia's total lack of commitment to peace, its disdain for international law, and its complete disregard for human life. Russia's aggression has entered its third year, and unfortunately we are no closer to the end of this illegal, unjustified, and unprovoked war. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 10,000 civilians have been killed and more than 18,500 injured. With each passing day, the damage and humanitarian consequences this conflict is causing to Ukraine, as well as to the international security, becomes increasingly evident. Malta will continue to seek justice and full accountability for all crimes committed in connection with Russia's war against Ukraine, including for the crime of aggression. Malta fully supports the important work of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine in their investigation efforts. We must restore international peace and security to shape a better future for our children. In closing, President, Malta reiterates that the only step towards a just and lasting peace would be for Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and unconditionally, completely withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of